Thank you. Yeah.
Wow. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session that we're calling Sex and the Revolution, not the Veil, as you might have thought.
We renamed it.
We've renamed it.
Feminism.
I'm going to give an introduction for Mona. And I will have to say, because I live under a rock, I somehow missed her article in the Foreign Policy magazine's sex issue, Why Do They Hate Us? That sensationally titled article about why Arab men hate Arab women. And the answer, according to Mona, is a toxic mix of culture and religion. And it resulted in a firestorm of controversy, thousands of comments, hundreds of follow-up interviews, articles, blog posts, including responses from many angry Arab feminists, veiled and otherwise, who distanced themselves from Mona's articles. I've now caught up with the original article, and I've read her book, Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution. And I think Mona has addressed many of the sticking points in the original article, and she uses her own personal journey to explain how she thinks misogyny works in Middle Eastern cultures. And so the book is a kind of memoir about feminism and sex, but also chock full of some horrifying statistics and facts. One of the most insightful observations that I got from the book was the division that Mona makes about the problem of violence against women into three sectors. The state, meaning the police, the legal system, and other institutional spaces. The street, meaning the general public and the male gaze and the problems of moving around in society as females. And the home, meaning patriarchal and misogynist family structures, and the traditionalist gender roles and expectations that we have at home. So I think these divisions form a very, very useful construct for identifying some of the myriad issues we have to address in order to even talk about violence against women and see if we can even stem it in any way. I'm unconvinced this is an Islamic problem, as many issues as I do have with Islamic practice, or any orthodox religious practice in general. But that said, I'm in full agreement with this statement of Mona's. Unless we draw a connection between the misogyny of the state and of the street, and unless we emphasize the need for a social and sexual revolution, our political revolutions will fail. So I'll just touch briefly on the veil as well. But she rails against the hijab and the veil as contributing towards the disappearing of women, which I believe is a real and dangerous phenomenon. I've seen it happening in Bangladesh, which is my home country, as we speak. And the more women cover up, the more conspicuous and endangered the uncovered become, and everybody in general. The last thing I want to say in introduction to her book is how much I loved the litany that she includes throughout the book of the incredibly courageous and eloquent women activists and revolutionaries across the Arab world and in North Africa. It's a fabulous honoring. And this quote that I'm going to end this introduction with by Mona, I think beautifully represents her ethos and mine. The most subversive thing a woman can do is talk about her life as if it really matters, and it does.
Thank you, Abi, for that very kind introduction, and it's such a pleasure to be on stage with you, not just because our colors are fabulous, but because I'm really happy to be with a very strong feminist woman of color on the stage talking about feminism. And thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see such a large audience for feminism, because I believe that feminism is a very vital and necessary movement, and it continues everywhere. And before I start, this is how I begin most of my events for my book. Patriarchy. Now, for those of you who are squeamish or easily offended, I have to warn you, I say a lot. So I have prepared you, okay. Continuing with that, I will give you a very brief idea of how the essay, Why Do They Hate Us, and then the book came about. And then Abir and I will be in conversation, and then I'd love to hear your questions, because I don't like to just sit here and lecture you. I really do want to engage, especially because we're in India, and I'm from Egypt, and Abir has roots in Bangladesh and in Nigeria. And for me, as an Egyptian and as a feminist and as a Muslim, to talk as women of color, and to talk about feminism in Egypt, in India, in Bangladesh, in Nigeria, is a huge relief, because we're not talking about white people here. This is us. We're not being defensive about our cultural practices. We're not feeling the need to defend our men against racism. We are talking about what should be in the center of this frame when we talk about feminism and when we talk about equality, and that is women, whether they're women in India or women in Egypt or women in Bangladesh, or globally, albeit, but I want to focus on women and to talk about women as women of color. Now, the reason I wrote this essay, and actually before it, several columns for The Guardian, because I'm an opinion writer, and I've been writing opinion pieces now for more than 15 years, is because very soon after the Egyptian revolution, as we know it, today is the anniversary of the January the 25th, 2011. So I salute the revolution, and the revolution continues. And I know that many people in Egypt and across the region are very much of the belief that the revolution continues, even though our current fascist dictator, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, would wish it were otherwise. But very soon after the January 25th, 2011 revolution began, February the 11th, Hosni Mubarak was forced to step down. And less than a month after that, the military from which Abdel Fattah al-Sisi comes, committed an incredibly heinous crime against Egyptian women revolutionaries in the form of so-called virginity tests. So in order to clear Tahrir Square, less than a month after Mubarak stepped down, the military took in all of the protesters who were in Tahrir Square, men and women. These are our revolutionary heroes. And they separated the women into a line. They told them married women in one line and single women in another line. And this is based on the assumption that if you're a single woman, you are quote unquote a virgin. And I would also like to state very early on that it is my goal in life to make obsolete the words virgin and hymen. These are words that should be struck from the dictionary. When the military separated women in these two lines, they told the women who stood in the single line that if we find that you do not have a hymen, we will charge you under the prostitution law. Because it's assumed that if a woman is not married and she has had sex, she must be a prostitute. Ultimately, what all of my work focuses on is ownership of my body. Who owns a woman's body? I ask this question now, and I will come back to it later. So these women were divided in these two lines, and a medical doctor basically stuck two fingers up the vaginal opening of these revolutionary heroes in search of this mythical membrane called the hymen. 17 women were sexually assaulted, because this is sexual assault. This is not a virginity test. This is, let's call it what it is. It's rape. It's sexual violence, and these women were sexually violated by our military, which portrays itself as the savior of the revolution because they didn't open fire on people in Tahrir. So when this crime happened, the Guardian newspaper wrote to me and said, would you like to write an opinion piece? And I wrote an opinion piece. I was so proud of the revolution, because this is something that so many of us have been dreaming of for years. When this happened, it was an incredible shock. And the first Egyptian woman to expose this crime was called a liar, and she was told, you were trying to make our military look bad. This constant need to defend our men. Why should I defend our men if our men constantly violate us? Again, who owns my body? So the first woman was called a liar, then another woman came forward, then another woman came forward. And I wrote an opinion piece for The Guardian in which I said, you know, in full belief, this is going to cause another revolution now. Now we're going to have the real revolution, which is a revolution for women's equality. Because these revolutions that began in Tunisia, in Egypt, and Syria, they were not about feminism, they were not about gender equality. They were about men and women rising up against the Mubarak in the presidential palace, Ben Ali in Tunisia, Gaddafi in Libya, etc., in Syria, in Bahrain, in Yemen, all of those countries. But in examining Egypt and seeing that there was more outrage directed against a young woman who stripped naked and posted a picture of herself in her parents' living room, this young Egyptian woman called Alia El-Mahdi did not go out onto the street and strip. There's a long history of women using nudity for political protest. This woman took her clothes off in her parents' living room and posted a picture on her blog. There was more outrage directed at this woman than against the military that sexually violated our revolutionary heroes. I looked at this and I thought, how is this happening? During revolutionary times in Egypt, again, who owns my body? So I wrote this columns for The Guardian, and then in November of 2011, I went to Egypt to join protests just outside of Tahrir Square, between Tahrir and the Interior Ministry, on a street called Muhammad Mahmoud. This street is now an icon of the revolution, because over 5 days, we, the revolution, were in battle against the police and the military. At least 40 people were killed. At least 300 were injured, including myself. Egyptian riot police beat me, broke my left arm, broke my right hand, sexually assaulted me, and detained me. 6 hours with the police and 6 hours with military intelligence. I was blindfolded and interrogated with my broken arms and denied a visit by a doctor. All of this was just making me angrier and angrier. And I'm a big fan of anger, especially angry women, because angry women are free women. And I celebrate anger in women. We're often told, don't be angry, be nice, be polite. Nice and polite. Nice and polite achieve nothing. Anger is the way. And so I wrote an essay before Why Do They Hate Us for The Guardian about what happened to me with one finger, because both of my arms were in a cast for 3 months. I wrote an essay about exactly what happened to me that night. And then Foreign Policy wrote to me and said, would you like to write an essay on women's rights? And I said, I do. And I told them specifically, and this is to answer the controversy, that I want to piss off as many people as possible, because this is the time to challenge why people are angrier over a woman's nudity than the military sexually violating a woman's body. And those women who were sexually violated through so-called virginity tests, they also had the headscarves ripped off their heads. So my book is called Headscarves and Hymens, because I believe that among Muslims, I'm a Muslim, and non-Muslims, Muslim women are reduced to what's on our head and what's in between our legs, our headscarves and our hymens. And on that day, March 9th, when the military took those women in, they took their headscarves off and violated their hymens. So I wrote this essay for The Guardian, and then the Foreign Policy article came when I could finally write with my 10 fingers. And I channeled all my rage into that essay. And people ask me, did you write that essay because you were angry? Of course I was angry. Who isn't angry when they've had their arms broken and they have been sexually assaulted? But I wasn't just angry for me. I was angry for 2 teenage girls in Morocco who were raped and forced to marry their rapists. Because there's a law that the French colonial powers in Morocco, just as the Victorian Brits here put a law in the Indian statutes criminalizing homosexuality, the French and the Brits took care of our legal codes in the Middle East and North Africa and put a law in Morocco allowing a rapist to escape conviction if he agrees to marry his victim. Those 2 girls who committed suicide, one was 12 and one was 16, because of what happened to them, Moroccan men and women flooded the streets of their cities and managed to reverse that law. So I wrote this essay, and yes, they deserve all of the credit. I wrote this essay, and I ended this essay by saying that these uprisings and revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa were began by a man, a Tunisian man called Mohamed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire. Again, who owns my body? He set himself on fire in Tunisia, December 2010, and ignited revolutions across the region. And I said, an Arab man, or a man from the Middle East and North Africa, because I don't like to use the word Arab, not everybody identifies as Arab in the region, but a man from the region started these revolutions, and it will be women from the Middle East and North Africa who will complete these revolutions. And that's how my book came about, because I wanted to expand the essay into a book.
I'd like to know, you have this term about this global revolution in sexuality. How would you define that? How do you see that playing out in the world?
The sexual revolution?
The sexual revolution.
Well, the subtitle of my book is called Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution. And as Abby had mentioned when she was introducing me, there's a trifecta of misogyny that is at play. that we have to dismantle as part of dismantling patriarchy. And that trifecta on the 3 points of the triangle is the state, the street, and the home. And when I define what I mean by the sexual revolution begins with the premise, I own my body. So we're back to that question I asked at the beginning when I started explaining to you how I wrote the essay in the book. So the sexual revolution is, I own my body. Not the state, not the mosque, not the church, not the temple, and not my family. When I make that statement, and I make it clear that I own my body, fighting female genital mutilation becomes a revolutionary act. Fighting marital rape becomes a revolutionary act. Fighting street sexual violence becomes a revolutionary act. And the most revolutionary act of all of this, considering the toxic mix of religion and culture, and I'm assuming many people in the audience are from India, and you will understand what I'm saying here, because you also have a toxic mix of religion and culture, whether you're Hindu or Muslim or Sikh or any other religion in India. The sexual revolution will apply equally here as it does to where I come from. And taking that I own my body, I continue it or complete it by saying, it is my right to have sex whenever, with whomever, with their consent, of course. Inside marriage, consent is a good thing. Inside marriage, outside of marriage, with a woman, with a man, with whomever I choose. That is my right. And I mentioned India here because I realize that when I speak about these issues, and you mentioned Islam, Abir, I realize that in India, I'm also walking into a minefield because Muslims in this country are a minority, and I know that there's a lot of discrimination against Muslims in this country, and I don't want anyone to walk away from this session believing that Islam owns the copyright to misogyny and patriarchy. It doesn't. The Hindu religion, the Christian religion, Judaism, Islam, most religions, with very few exceptions, behave like they actually believe that they have the right to control a woman's body. And most religions are specifically obsessed with women's vaginas. And my message to all religions and the men of those religions is stay out of my vagina unless I want you in there.
So there's this interview that you gave in Arabic. Mona was just telling me about this before the session started. And it's one of the longer interviews you've given in Arabic. And in it, she says much of what she just said to you right now, but in Arabic, and it caused a firestorm of controversy.
Yes.
And she got amazing amounts of backlash and like all this vitriol that came her way. Do you want to talk a little bit about how
Sure.
the publication of your book as well, which has not been published in Arabic, by the way. It's been translated into a bunch of other languages, but not in Arabic.
Yeah, my book will be translated into Turkish, which would be the first language from the region or a majority Muslim country that will publish my book in its language. But we're struggling to get it published in Arabic for obvious reasons, because I do say this. And you know, this will take us into something that Abir and I were discussing earlier before we came to this event. When you're a woman of color, when you're a woman from a specific religious or cultural background, when you're a woman generally, but specifically when you are all of these identities, and I'm Egyptian, I'm Muslim, I'm a feminist, I travel between different worlds, and I speak openly about sex. There are certain things that we're allowed to talk about, and I'm sure, and I would love to hear your opinion on this, Abir, as well, because I know that this is something that your work engages with as well. There are things we're allowed to talk about and things we're not allowed to talk about. And it's those things we're not allowed to talk about that interest me the most. And you will see this come up again and again when women are writing. Because women are given this box of what we're allowed to say. And also when you come from all these different identities, specifically these days, and that's why I mentioned discrimination against Muslims in India, and this is a particularly troublesome time in India with all of these stories of intolerance and attacks against Muslims. So I'm trying to imagine being an Indian feminist Muslim writer wading into this minefield where I want to criticize the misogyny of my community, but I'm very aware of the bigotry and the discrimination that is coming against the men of my community. Where does my allegiance lie? And my allegiance lies with women. My allegiance is always with women. Women are number one for me. But at the same time, I will not put up with the right-wing Islamophobes or xenophobes. They can I want nothing to do with them. So whether you're a BJP Hindu fundamentalist or you're any kind of fundamentalist, you are not my ally, you are not my friend, and I will not ally myself with you to attack Muslim men. But at the same time, my message to Muslim men is, I will not be silent if any of you is misogynist in order to fight the bigotry of the BJP or anybody else. So my allegiance is with women. And because of this sexual revolution that I'm talking about, it's especially important for me to say these things in Arabic because it's such a taboo to say them in Arabic. And so I gave this interview to France 24, and it was broadcast, and within 2 hours, hashtag sexual revolution in Arabic was trending across the region. And I was getting tweets saying things like, so can I come and now? When the sexual revolution begins, does that mean when there's curfew we can go to the strip bar, the strip club? And I've also got attacked by various men, including artists and so-called intellectuals, who are not feminists just because they're artsy-fartsy, you know? That doesn't guarantee feminism. Activist men, revolutionary men, ipso facto not revolutionary. Prove your feminist. They're not just because they're out there on the streets fighting dictators necessarily feminist. I need you to prove your feminism. One artist wrote to me and said, with all of these wars happening, you think this is the time to talk about sex? What are you, desperate? Basically, you need a good And you know what? I get plenty of sex, thank you. I don't need a good I get plenty of good What I want is a good sexual revolution in which I can talk openly about these issues that we're not allowed to talk about. And so that's why it's important. And I would love to hear from you, Abir, because I know that you write erotica. Tell me.
Yeah, so on that note, actually it is interesting what you're talking about. Like, it's really, fundamentalism is one thing when you're faced up, and it's sort of really obvious what it is that's against you, but something that's even more subtle, which is what you talk about facing the patriarchy or misogyny that comes from the home. And so when I started writing erotica, I actually, did not even think about anything, and I just published it under my own name. And there was a column in this website called nerve.com that used to be big in the 90s, and it was a bad sex column. And I published a column in it, and there were stories by readers about bad sex. And it came out there, and I was a little perturbed because it was bad sex by Abir Haq, and I was thinking, no, it's not, it's not because of me, that the bad sex happened. It was something else. But anyway, it went up there, and it was up there for a long time. And then when my book was coming out, I thought, I don't know whether I want this up there anymore for people to see. It was a very explicit, graphic sex story. And I wasn't really afraid of the fundamentalists. I was afraid of my family, reading it, because so far I think my parents haven't Googled me, or my family. Maybe I'm delusional. But so I actually called up nerve.com and I said, can you please take this bad sex article off? And they were like, oh, we always get that request. And so they did it right away. But it's a really, it's a tough thing to actually put yourself out there and talk about these things, which aren't necessarily considered the important political issues of the moment, but are important to talk about, and women don't get to talk about them because they're outrageous or out of the pale.
Yeah, it's always unbelievable to me that when we talk about women's issues and we talk about feminism, people will bring up 10 other issues that must come first. Don't you know there are 40,000 people in prison in Egypt? Of course I know. Don't you know that there's torture? Don't you know that our education system is failing? Don't you know? Don't you know? Well, my answer is, don't you know that we are 50% of society? Do we not count? People talk about women's issues as if we're fluff, as if we're a luxury item. So when we finish this list of things, we will get to you. And the point of my book and the point of much of my writing is you will get to nothing until women are equal and liberated. Because no society that oppresses women is a free society.
I want to bring up this idea of intersectionality, which has been a huge deal. At least I'm glad people are talking about it now. For example, in feminism, and we talk about white feminism or white feminists, and how these movements have left out people of color or women of color, or the trans movements or the LGBT movements. And so I think maybe you could talk about Lebanon, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that would be lovely. A great story about one of the first LGBT movements in the Middle East.
Right. Well, my feminism came about in Saudi Arabia. I was a 19-year-old university student. And there's no women's and gender studies departments in universities in Saudi Arabia. But somehow, on the bookshelves of my university, I found all these feminist journals. So, some dissident, revolutionary librarian or professor put these feminist books on the bookshelf, and I found them, and they gave me the word to describe what I'd been feeling. I say that I was traumatized into feminism in Saudi Arabia because it was such a shock to my system. I'm from a Muslim family. My parents are both doctors. My siblings and I were raised with the belief that knowledge and education are the most important things. My parents met in medical school, they fell in love in medical school, and they took us to the UK on a government scholarship to get a PhD in medicine. So I was brought up in a feminist home. And then we moved to Saudi Arabia, and my world is turned upside down. I fell into a deep depression. And that's when I say I was traumatized into feminism, and then I found these books. So my feminism was given, was watered. The blossoms of my feminism were given to me by women of color. So Egyptian feminists like Nawal Saadawi, the Moroccan feminist who recently passed away, Fatima Mernissi, and others in the region, and I mentioned many of them in my book. So that's the foundation of my feminism. Obviously, the feminism of women like Gloria Steinem and Robin Morgan, who I'm lucky to call friends of mine, is important. But I'm not white, and I don't have the luxury of fighting just sexism, just misogyny. I'm fighting racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, so many other phobias. It's fucking exhausting. But we need to fight. We need to fight all of those isms and all of those phobias because we will not be free if our LGBTQ brothers and sisters are not free. We will not be free if a Dalit student commits suicide and all of these issues in India are pushed under the rug. We will not be free if anyone in society is not free. So I'm at the stage now where the feminists that I love to quote the most are black feminists like Bell Hooks, whose feminism has informed a lot of my more recent work, and the lesbian black poet, feminist Audre Lorde, and the Chicana, also lesbian poet and political thinker Gloria Anzaldúa. All of those women stand on the intersection of all of these battles that we have to fight as feminists of color. And Bell Hooks makes it very clear in all of her books that you have to fight that double fight against racism, against sexism. Because in the United States, if you're a black feminist, you know that anything you say about black men can and will be used against black men by racists. The United States continues to be a very racist country. And you heard me call out that fascist Donald Trump yesterday, who yesterday threw out a Sikh man and mocked him. So, every community in the United States has been mocked and vilified by Donald Trump. So to be a black feminist or to be a feminist of color in the United States, imagine being a feminist, as I said here, Muslim feminist, Dalit feminist, a feminist from any community that is under attack by a majority or by bigotry. We need to stand on that intersection and fight all of those fights. And when it comes to LGBT issues especially, this is where we need intersectionality. And I was telling Abir, and I mentioned in my book, that the first movement for LGBTQ rights in the Middle East and North Africa was in Lebanon. A good friend of mine was a co-founder, and it was a fantastic movement. But here's the thing. Men dominated everything, as men do, even in the LGBTQ movement. So women broke away and formed a movement for lesbian and bisexual women and the transgender in Lebanon called MEME. And this MEME comes from the Arabic word, it actually comes from the Arabic letter, MEME. And it's very important because I say in my book over and over, without language, things don't become real. And for a very long time in Arabic, we had no word for feminism. And so it was assumed that we were importing it from the West. We would say feminism. Someone came up with the word Nasawiyya. So we had a word in Arabic, indigenous to us, that we could now use to talk about feminism. And now someone recently came up with the word for same-sex relations. It literally means same sex. In the past, and unfortunately until today, homophobes will use the word deviant or pervert. But now we have for the male of the word mithli and the female of the word mithliya. So that movement for the lesbian and bisexual women in Lebanon, it stands for mithliya. I don't know about Hindi and Urdu and Gujarati and all the other languages here, but are there any equivalent words for feminism and same-sex relations that will make what we're fighting for real through words?
I have to say, I don't know Bangla well enough to be able to answer that question for Bengali, but I do think that one of the things I did want to mention is this idea of intersectionality positively influencing publishing, for example. Yes. Camila Shamsi had this beautiful article that she wrote about the year of publishing women, where I think she took an anniversary of the women's vote suffrage movement in the UK, and I think it's 2017, and she put out a call to publishers to publish only women.
Right.
And which I think would be really amazing, and my own sort of take on that was to try to read only women for like 3 months at a time or something like this. But then some of the responses that came back from that is that maybe it would just become sort of a year of publishing white women. And that would be sort of, you know, that would be kind of what actually ends up happening is that basically the white world ends up taking the publishing industry. And so I think there's a lot we can talk about in that.
Well, I think this idea also that we have to make our feminism more radically intersectional. And I realized, you know, this session was called The Veil, which I don't like. I don't just talk about the veil. You know, I wore the headscarf for 9 years and I took it off. So I say I chose to wear the hijab and I chose to take it off, but it took me 8 years to take it off. So why is it easier to choose to do something than to choose to stop doing it? So that's my own internal struggle among fellow Muslims. But here's the thing, when I talk about the headscarf and when I talk about the face veil and how I want to ban the face veil everywhere, I do not want to be allied with a xenophobic, Islamophobic right wing that has been doing this across Europe. Those are not my allies, as I said. But at the same time, I realize that because it's such a loaded issue and is often used in racist discourse against Muslim women, when you look at after the Paris attacks and after the San Bernardino attacks in the United States, attacks against Muslims have tripled. But specifically Muslim women who are visibly Muslim, i.e. wear headscarves and face veils. In this atmosphere, I recognize that anything I talk about when it comes to headscarves and face veils can and will be used against Muslim women who are on the front line of this. Donald Trump said something about how we have to make Muslims wear identifying marks that reminded a lot of people of those horrific golden stars of David, yellow stars of David, that the Holocaust, that the Nazi regime made Jews wear in Germany. So Donald Trump is basically asking Muslims to wear identifying symbols. Muslim women do. Muslim women's headscarves are their identifying symbols, and they're on that front line of these vicious attacks against Muslims. I don't want to contribute to that. So I'm at the stage now when I talk about headscarves and face veils where I say white people, including white women and men, have to sit down and listen to Muslim women. No more, this is my opinion on veils and burqas and face veils. This is our opinion. This is our fight. This is a fight that Muslim women have to have among themselves, and any voices and any discussions, whether they're for or against the veil, have to be led and had by Muslims, because it's too easy to use this veil discussion in a racist way against specifically Muslim women.
And by women, not just Muslims, but by women. I feel like this idea of finding your voice in a global way, or in a Muslim or in a feminist aspect is something that I think is something that's really important, that we need to have space for those voices, but it's really hard to get those voices out there. And so do you have any thoughts about how people get to have their voices heard?
Well, you know, we need stage upon stage of, when I'm talking about Muslim women, for example, of Muslim women of different opinions. One of the things I enjoy the most when I'm on book tour is when a group of Muslim women in headscarves come and have really heated arguments with me about why I don't consider the headscarf feminist. And after, you know, we have this over and over, and I turn to the room and I say, this is a really important argument that you're witnessing, because it's complicating the image of Muslim women. You don't no one complicates, and complication and confusion are really important, because Muslim women are these figures you see in the background of news stories. I call them silent covered in black Muslim women. In media coverage of Muslims, usually you have the angry bearded Muslim man. He's in a protest somewhere, burning the flag of America or Israel or whatever, or he's now in the form of those murderous raping shits called ISIS. So that's the image of Muslim man now. Obviously, a tiny minority of what Muslim men are. And for women, we're just silent and covered in black. So when you see Muslim women arguing, and it's necessary to see that, you see that Muslim women are many things. We're not just covered in black, and we're not just veiled. I am Muslim. I have red hair and I have tattoos. And I'm happy to have a vivid argument with a Muslim woman in a headscarf or in a face veil. So we need that space for complication. Complication humanizes people. Oversimplification dehumanizes people.
In the context of a festival like this, Jaipur, one of the largest, maybe the largest literary festival. So the people you see on stage, this is another thing that I think that Mona and I talked about, is seeing women on stage or people of color on stage, and the effort to make sure that panels have a mix of people on them. Every panel should have at least a woman on it. For example, I think Mona was at a panel for the coming out panel, where there was 3 gay men on the stage and there was no women. And so these kinds of things have to be addressed, and they have to be done at the top level, where somebody realizes that the panel makeup is really important, that you get to see, like that visual actually is really important, that you get to see women and people of color on the
especially
stage.
because this festival is in India. And you know, you're a huge country, you have a huge book buying population, and generally speaking, I don't know if this statistic is true for India, but you know who buys most books? It's women. So we keep the publishing industry alive. Every stage should have a woman. Every stage should have a writer of color. Every stage must be that diversity that we're looking for. Because if we don't have a huge festival like Jaipur, creating these spaces for complication,
And
how
being
then
an example of it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We exist. We are there. So every stage must have all those voices, because as I said, complication humanizes.
All right, I think I'm sure you guys all have a lot of questions, and so I'm maybe going to turn it over to people who would like to ask questions. I don't know how we'll do this. How about that lady who's, waving her hand over there in the teal scarf? Sorry?
Hi,
Oh, yeah.
I'm Shambhavi. Great talk. My question is that being who you are, being a Muslim, and being the way you are, not wearing a headscarf and stuff, it must be so difficult. And how do you deal with it? How do you deal with the discrimination and the criticism that is thrown on you? And how do you deal with the people who want you to supposedly toe the line?
Yes.
So that's.
Well, you know, I consider myself to be a person with great privilege. And I consider myself someone who has lived the experience of, you know, I said I wore a headscarf for 9 years, and I believe that when we have privilege of any kind, we're obliged to fight 10 times harder than those who don't have privilege. And I think everyone in this room has privilege of some form. Just the very fact that you can be at a literary festival means that you have some kind of privilege. And I think we have to use that to create space for those who have less privilege. I never say I'm speaking for someone. I speak for myself. I never say I'm giving a voice to the voices, because that's ridiculous. Everyone has a voice. If you don't hear their voice, it's either because they've been silenced or they're not given that space on the stage to speak. So I'm now 48 years old. When I was younger, I didn't have these spaces. I didn't have this privilege that I have. So I feel, just in the way that I found all those feminist books in my library when I was 19 years old, those books saved my life. Those books saved my mind. It was a very difficult time in my life when I was struggling with my headscarf and trying to take it off. And I discovered all of these women from my background, from my faith and cultural background, who gave me the weapons and ammunition I needed to become strong enough to take off my headscarf. And so those women gave me their shoulders to stand on. So I wrote my book, and I give a lot of these talks, remembering 19-year-old me and how she felt and how she was trying to create her own voice. And I hope my book is my way, I like to think of my book as my way of giving my shoulders to younger women. And I dedicate my book to the young women of the Middle East and North Africa, and I dedicate it to young women everywhere. And I say to them, be immodest, rebel, disobey, and know you deserve to be free. Because those are the 4 things that matter the most.
Maybe this young woman over here in the front. Yeah, you.
Namaste.
Namaste.
I have 2 questions. The first one is for female genital mutilation, which originated in Egypt. Okay. There's a statistic that this process has been enforced more by the women on the women. It's something like women being misogynist. Okay, so there's this, when they're banned from countries like Chad and other places, midwives from other countries are taken over to those countries,
Yes.
and they perform the process. So what is your comment about women being misogynist?
Okay. All right. Do you have another question, or is that the only question?
Yeah, the second question is I am originally from a place which is west in Assam. Okay, so I have a lot of Bangladeshi immigrants, and the ethnicity that Boro tribes, they are highly matriarchal, and these Bangladeshi immigrants are patriarchal. Hence, there is a huge clash in 2012.
Okay.
2012, yes. So this clash was basically about the matriarchal society versus the patriarchal society, which was been politicized into a religious fight.
Yes.
So it's my question. I want your comment on this.
Thank you for two very good questions.
Yeah.
When it comes to female genital mutilation, I think it's really important to remember that when we're talking about women being misogynist, we have to start with the understanding and the belief that women are not stupid. Women understand what they need to do and what they need to say in order to survive. And in a patriarchal society that enforces, now see, what is the reason for female genital mutilation? The reason is to control women's sexuality. In the various countries where it's practiced, including here in India, because it exists here among the Buhari community, and I know that there is a petition to break the taboo and to start talking about it and to help eradicate it. Depending on which country you come from, it is performed on a girl at different ages. In my country, Egypt, it's between the age of 6 to 9. And sadly, up to 91% of Egyptian women between the age of 15 to 49 have been subjected to this awful and harmful traditional practice. But it's practiced by Muslims and Christians. This is not specific to religion. And the further down you go in various parts of Africa, it's also practiced by animists, and it's traveled across the world to Malaysia, Indonesia. Anyway, the whole aim of this is to control women's sexuality. When people ask me, why do women do this to their daughters? My answer actually often confuses them. They do it to their daughters because they love their daughters. And this sounds awful, but the truth of the matter is they want their daughters to be accepted in a society that has told them, you must do this in order for your daughter to get married. And I'll give you concrete proof of this. In 1994, when the UN had the population conference in Cairo, I was very involved with many feminist groups in Egypt who gave me research they carried out on reproductive health in Egypt. And there was one anecdote I will never forget. A 17-year-old young woman was married, and on her wedding night, her husband discovered that she had not been cut. He sent her back to her mother with the message, if you want your daughter to be married, you know what you need to do. And she called the midwife and had her daughter cut and sent back to her husband. This is why I said women are not stupid. Women do this because they want their daughters to be accepted in a very patriarchal society that wants to control women's sexuality. That's why I said, stay out of my vagina unless I want you in there. So we can't come to the mothers who in this scenario, in this very patriarchal society, in that trifecta of misogyny, and say, you change. You hate other women. They are doing what they need to do to help their daughters survive. We have to dismantle patriarchy holistically. We have to go to the imams and the priests, because in Egypt it's Muslims and Christians. We have to go to the traditional midwives and find them other jobs so that their income isn't just from this. We have to explain to husbands that you will enjoy sex better when you get married, when your wife enjoys sex. So we have to talk about the sexual revolution, and it is my right to have sex and enjoy sex. And we also have to challenge our society. This is where those of us with privilege now, I feel now powerful enough in my own society to be this figure that says, I am an unmarried Muslim woman who has sex and I enjoy it. And I will have sex with anyone I want. Not everybody can say this because they need to survive. I'm at the stage now where I can say it because I have this platform, you know? So mothers will stop doing this to their daughters when we stop living in patriarchy. So let's dismantle patriarchy. Now your question about matriarchy and patriarchy is a very relevant question to geopolitics around the world today, because I got this question a lot when I was on my book tour. I would go to various European countries and they would ask me, all these refugees coming with their culture, they're coming to ruin my culture. How are we going to live together? This is how we live together, when everybody obeys the law. Whether you're from a patriarchy or a matriarchy, the law must put women and women's safety and women's bodily integrity in the middle. Anyone who breaks the law, whether they're from a matriarchy or patriarchy, must suffer the consequence and be held accountable. Here's what ends up happening, and that's why you said it became a religious issue. Women and our bodies end up becoming political footballs. The left wing and the right wing, they don't care about women. They care about fighting each other, and we're the political football in the middle. So let's recognize this and say everybody, regardless of religion or culture or matriarchy or patriarchy, must respect the law, and we must ensure that that law is a law that takes women's equality and liberation into account.
Nice. Maybe we'll take one from the back. How about the man in black?
Hi. You talked about how women are treated in the streets and how they're treated at their house and how religion plays a part. Actually, I'm not quite sure how popular culture is in the Middle Eastern region and in North Africa. Can you elaborate a little on the portrayal of women in the Middle Eastern and North African region and in movies and in TV and how it's...
Yeah,
like-
absolutely. I discuss this in my book, and I talk in a chapter that I have on violence against women, whether it's in the street or in the home, that unfortunately it's become normalized because a lot of our films and drama, and now remember Egypt is like, you know, you have Bollywood and you have Nollywood. Nigeria ends up producing a lot of films for Africa. Hollywood, we have, Egypt was, I don't know what to call it, a Cairo wood. For a very long time, Egypt was the center of the arts and culture in the Middle East and North Africa. So all the drama shows and all the films that we produced in Egypt are all watched across the region, and the Egyptian dialect of Arabic is probably the most understood. So when I was living in Jerusalem, I was a Reuters correspondent, I would call up to speak to a minister, and the assistant to the minister would say, oh my God, can you please talk some more because I love your accent. So the Egyptian Arabic is, you know, the most understood. But that also means that the images that we portray in our movies are all across the region. And unfortunately, in almost every TV show and almost every film, a woman is smacked, almost like you expect it. Smack here and smack there. And we need to fight that. This is why we need women everywhere. We need women not just in our Houses of Parliament to create legislation that will answer this young woman's question here when I said to her about the law and everyone respecting the law. We need women filmmakers, we need women who write scripts for these films, we need women producers, we need women directors. And this is obviously an issue not just in the Middle East and North Africa, it's in Hollywood too. I'm sure you're familiar with hashtag Oscars So White. That most of the people nominated were white. We need more women directors everywhere because Hollywood images are also damaging to women. But specifically in the Middle East and North Africa, I'm sure that I would have a lot in common when I talk to people in Bollywood. What is the image of women in films made in India? I'm sure you need, I'm not that familiar with Bollywood films, but they're very popular in Egypt, I have to tell you. But I can tell because globally, we don't have enough representation for women. So that's definitely something that many feminists in the region are fighting to stop this kind of smack, almost ordinary portrayal. But here's something else that pop culture is doing now. As I call him, our current fascist dictator, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, is on a moral crusade. And he's on a moral crusade that has been imprisoning atheists, gay men, trans women, and pop stars and belly dancers. And this moral crusade puts all these people in jail under this law we have called, quote-unquote, inciting debauchery. I mentioned this briefly on the panel yesterday on the revolutions and uprisings, and what ends up happening is a belly dancer or a pop star uploads a video to YouTube. Now, regardless of its cultural content, regardless of how much you like it or not, that woman has the right to dance in her video in whatever way she wants to dance. She uploads it to YouTube, and you get some attorney, who's obviously a pro-regime attorney. He raises a case against her under this law of inciting debauchery, and this pop star ends up going to jail for 6 months for inciting debauchery. This is, I consider, part of the social sexual revolution. Because if we have a fascist dictator that is actively fighting any revolutionary or any opposing voice, including a woman and her ability to use her body in the way that she wants, that is part of the social sexual revolution. If I'm talking about I own my body, I also have to remind you that while we have smack in our films, we have these pop stars and women going to jail just because they're dancing on video, and our regime considers it inciting debauchery. It's much more insightful that our jails are full of, have 40,000 political prisoners than a woman dancing on video. So it's all part of this revolutionary atmosphere in which women are saying, I own my body.
All right. How about way in the back over there? Yeah, you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so my question is basically about the fact that you spoke about how women are extremely important to the feminist cause. and you spoke about how women need to claim their space in a certain sense. But I would like to ask, as a feminist, as a man, what can a man do in this entire process to make it something that is sustainable, that is about what feminism is about, which is equality for all?
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice.
Thank you for that question, and I salute you as a feminist ally. And I use the word ally because it's really important that men also don't try to overtake the feminist movement, because you know what guys are like. There's, there's something about penises that makes you guys want to dominate everything, but that's another discussion. I'll tell you 2 anecdotes in order to answer your question. And this speaks to Egypt as well, and how this feminist awareness is rising in Egypt as part of this social sexual revolution that I talk about. Just before my book was published in April of last year, I got an invitation to speak at a TEDx. You know those TEDx events, right? So at a TEDx event in a university in a town called Zagazig. This is a very conservative Muslim Brotherhood-dominated town, and it's the birthplace of Mohammed Morsi, who was our short-lived president from the Muslim Brotherhood. And this invitation was from the university. It was at the university in this town, and the university students organized the TEDx, and the head of the organizing committee was a 19-year-old male pharmacy student called Khalid. And Khalid emailed me and said, would you come and speak at our event in Arabic about feminism? And I immediately said, yes, of course I would. And he immediately replied and said, we are so excited, I'm so excited, because I believe that my community needs a feminist like you to shake it up. So here's a young man who understands that his liberation will come when women are liberated. He understands that it's connected. You cannot have a free society, and men cannot be free if women are not free. So I went there and I gave a talk, and my talk was about how in Egypt right now, this word terrorism and the war on terrorism, unfortunately, Sisi has inherited this from the Bush regime and keeps using this word terrorism against anyone he doesn't like. I don't like the word terrorism because it's obviously very politically loaded. Our enemies commit terrorism, our friends commit other kinds of violence. So I told the students at this TEDx, seeing as we keep using terrorism, here's one instance or one kind of violence I want to call terrorism, and it's violence against women. Because if the aim of terrorism is to change the behavior of a community, that's what violence against women does. Sexual violence on the streets here in India, as it does in Egypt, wants to remind women that men own public space and men are entitled to women's bodies. That's terrorism. Sexual violence is a form of terrorism. After I gave this talk, another young man at the university came up to me and he said, I'm 20 years old, I'm studying engineering here, I go out with my best friend, this guy, and he drives me crazy because he's constantly harassing women on the street, and I hate it, and I want him to stop. And he said, you know why I want it to stop? Because I watch 9 and 10-year-old boys watching him learning how to become a man. So this is where you come in now. When you see your friends behaving like shit, step in and say, stop it. Because this is hurting men as well as hurting women. This is where you have a responsibility. When I say this, you know, one of the things that I'm promoting, and I'm deadly serious about this, I'm promoting a curfew for boys and men. At least one day of every month, I want boys and men to stay at home after 7 p.m. And you'll see the rates of crime plummet, and you'll see women and girls happy in the streets. Thank you. You know what I'm told when I say this? I always get, you know that hashtag not all men? So I get hashtag not all men. So some guy will come on and say, I've never harassed a woman, not all men, blah, blah, blah. I say to him, okay, maybe not you personally, but you benefit from a system that allows other men to do this, so dismantle that system. Thank you.
I think one last question, a short question.
How about this lady in this third row? The one who's standing up.
This is to both of you. Your political praxis, we've seen in the revolution in Egypt, does not register women, right? A monk burning himself causes the Vietnam protests in America. A Tunisian fruit seller causes the revolution. For women to be heard is very, very hard. So, to both of you as writers, you write on your body, as is evident, you write with your bodies. What advice do you have for women writing, for women's speech to be heard? I mean, what is that register in which one gets heard for political praxis? Yeah?
Abir, answer.
I think, well, I'll just start anyway. I think it's really hard to think about how, at least for me, it's really hard to think about who else is going to be listening or reading in order to write it. And I actually have to erase all of that and start with just exactly what it is I want to write and forget about who's going to be reading it. And I feel like that ends up with the result that has the most integrity, it has the most truth to it. And I feel like whatever your truth is, in as clear ways you can express it, is going to be the thing that's going to get out there, and it's going to have the most power. So that's probably the register I think I would recommend, is just your own. Whatever it is, however it is you want to write is going to be the best way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love to quote Audre Lorde. I mentioned, the black lesbian poet Audre Lorde. She very famously said, your silence will not protect you. So whether you decide, oh, I'm going to be quiet because my family will read it, or what will the community say, what will people say, it still will not protect you at the end of the day. Nothing will protect you. So you might as well say your truth. But I know it's difficult because, one of the things I do, my book is not a memoir, but I do include personal stories. And I include personal stories because I recognize in 2005 in Egypt, this revolution didn't begin on January the 25th. Obviously, no revolution begins with one act. Rosa Parks refusing to stand up didn't begin the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks had decades of activism, specifically against sexual violence on black women's bodies by white men in the US. So obviously, January 25th was not, oh, suddenly we're going to have a revolution. It was years in the making. And one of those years was 2005, when it would be just 100 of us in Tahrir Square, in the streets of Cairo, saying down, down with Hosni Mubarak. Back then, we would say we are breaking the barrier of fear. When I talk about the social and sexual revolution, I'm breaking the barrier of taboo and shame. And so I included some of the stories of my own taboo and shame. So I include how I struggled with my hijab for 9 years. I include how I struggled with my sexuality, how long it took me, and how now I wish I hadn't waited so long to have sex, which is why I want to get rid of these words, virginity and hymen. So I consider it part, this daily acts of dissent. So think of the ways that you can engage in this breaking the barrier of taboo and shame, and how can you perform daily acts of dissent? Say the unsayable. Go to your red line and beyond it, and step over those barriers of taboo and shame, because your silence will not protect you. Our loud voices are what will protect us. Each woman obviously has to navigate that in her own life, because as I said, 19-year-old Mona and 48-year-old Mona are in very different places in their lives. But I believe as a 48-year-old that in the way that I learned from Nawal Saadawi and Fatima Mernissi and others, I'm hoping that those younger women who don't feel able to talk about sex and sexuality, for them to see other women talking openly about what they think is the taboo and the shame, help them. So it's these kind of constant circles of revolutionaries helping each other and reminding each other that our silence will not protect us.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry we're out of time, but thank you so much for coming.
Applause for Mona and Abi for the session, Not the Veil, right?
Not the veil.
Sex and the revolution.
Exactly.
Go out there, revolution.
Thank you.